Have you ever listened to a worship song and thought, there are a lot of sounds being played right now? As a worship keys player, how do you decide what sounds and parts you're going to play? Do you try to play all of the sounds or just one? And how do you even tell what those sounds are? In today's video, we're going to break down the common types of key sounds that you hear in modern worship music. And we'll walk through how to decide what sounds to play at any given time. Let's get started. Worship songs today often have multiple key sounds layered one atop the other. It can be kind of hard to distinguish what those sounds are and what parts are being played. If you're new to playing worship keys, or you come from a classical piano background, the idea of layering two or more sounds can be a bit intimidating. So let's break down the 5 most common sounds that we hear in modern worship music. The most common sound in modern worship music is the piano. And this is the most common because before there were keyboards, there were acoustic pianos. Today's worship music has origins in genres like country, rock and roll, gospel, and even goes all the way back to Baroque sacred music. All of these genres rely heavily on the piano or piano-like instruments to propel the accompaniment. Also, most churches, especially traditional churches, have a piano that's used for times of worship. So it makes sense that the piano is still a really common instrument in today's genre. Under the umbrella of piano are instruments that function like a piano. So the electric piano, the dulcimer, bells, or anything that has a percussive attack and a pure tone that follows. Here's a couple of those sounds as an example. The second most common sound that we hear in worship music is the pad. Now, pads generally fade in. They have a long sustain and then they have a generally long release, but that can vary a bit. So why are pads important? We use pads to lay the tonal foundation for the team, to sit underneath everything else musical that's happening and make sure that the space is full and that there are no awkward silences. There are lots of kinds of pads. When we describe these sounds, we often use words that are visual in nature or that describe how the sounds make us feel. So for a warm pad, what makes a pad warm, right? We use the word warm to describe a sound that is comforting, that has soft edges, maybe that feels like a hug. Warm pads sit right in the middle of the frequency range. So that means there's not a ton of low, like sub-bass type frequencies happening, and there's not a lot of high frequencies that are brighter and that stick out. So it fits right in the middle of the range and sits behind everything that's happening. A warm pad often has a slow attack and a slow release, which means that it fades in and it fades out without being noticed. So here's a couple examples of warm pads. Another type of pad is the bright pad. The word bright indicates that this sound sticks out of the crowd. It's noticeable. Maybe it makes us feel excited and big. It fills lots of space. It has lots of high frequencies. And that's what gives it the feeling of being bright, the fact that it has those frequencies that stick out in the mix and make it distinguishable. Bright pads often have a quicker attack and release than warm pads, but that amount can vary as well. So here's a couple of examples of different bright pads. Most pads fit into these two categories, but sounds can also be described in other ways, such as dark or airy or shimmery. There are other kinds of sounds as well that fit into the pads category. For example, string sounds, organ sounds, or anything that sustains as you hold it out could be considered a pad. Now, strings and organs both have characteristics that are specific to them, namely that they are designed after acoustic instruments. But when we are categorizing these sounds by type, they do fall into the pads group. The third most common sound is the lead sound. Now, synth leads can be used for moments that stick out in the mix, maybe for lead lines or riffs that you want to play with your right hand. Now, lead lines can be played with a piano sound, but sometimes you want that part to stick out a bit more in the mix or to sound a bit different. And this is where lead sounds come into play. Most of the time, you play lead lines with your right hand, which means that you'll only play 1 to 2 notes at a time. So lead sounds don't sustain for a long time like pads do. They decay over time, typically, so that as you're playing several notes in succession, the sound disappears so you can hear the new notes being played and it doesn't get too muddy. Leads can sound like just about anything, and just like with pads, we describe lead sounds by what they feel like. But unlike pads, those descriptions often refer to both the envelope of the sound, meaning how fast the sound appears and disappears, as well as the character of it. So, for example, there are bright lead sounds, just like there are bright pads. There are dark lead sounds and airy lead sounds. There are also plucked lead sounds, mono lead sounds, and mellow leads. So let's talk about bright lead sounds. Just like with pads, bright lead sounds can stick out in the mix. They have high frequency content and fill lots of space. The main thing that differentiates the bright pad and the bright lead is the envelope, or how quickly the sound appears and disappears. With lead sounds, this time is typically much shorter than with pads. So I'm going to show you a sound that is both bright and polyphonic, which means that you can play more than one note at a time with this type of sound. So let's talk about mono leads. The term mono is short for the word monophonic, which means that only one note can be played at any given time. A mono lead can be really fun to play because as you press a new note, the sound automatically moves to that new note without holding on to the previous one. You'll most often use a mono lead sound when you're playing a lead line that is fast and requires precision in order to play it accurately, or if you're looking for a sound that is very specific and can only fit this type of character. So here's an example of what that sounds like. The fourth most common type of sound is the arp. Now, the term arp is short for arpeggio, which means that as you hold down notes on the keyboard, those notes will be fed into an effect that spits the notes back out in a specified or a randomized order. Arps can be an effective tool for filling space and creating movement and interest. Arps can sound like just about anything, just like pads and lead sounds. But the way that we describe an arp is more about how they function. So let's talk about what's called a melodic arp or a mono arp. These types of arps are used to fill space in a non-specific way. You'll maybe hear 1 or 2 notes happening at any given time, going up and down, or randomly jumping high and low through the notes that you're holding down. Another instance of this would be if you were to set an arp effect to random and hold down a chord and just let all of the notes play in a randomized order. Here's an example of a melodic arp. Another type of arp is the chord arp or poly arp. These types of arps are used to propel moments and to keep time. When you're using a chord arp, you hold down the notes in your chord, and you'll hear all of the notes that you're holding played at the exact same time repetitively. This can be a great tool to fill space and to keep that time as you're moving through the song. So here's an example of what that sounds like. There are, of course, other ways to arpeggiate sounds that don't fit into these two categories, but these are the two most common types of arps that we see in modern worship music. The fifth most common sound is the bass sound. Now, synth bass sounds round out the entire sonic output that we create. These sounds are low in the frequency range, and they will likely conflict with the bass guitar if your team has one. If your team doesn't, then using a synth bass sound can really help to fill that space. Synth bass is not a super complicated sound, and there's not a lot of variation to it. These sounds exist to fill that low end of the frequency spectrum, but they can have some different characteristics. Some synth bass sounds have a bit of distortion on them, which allows them to have some of that brightness quality. Here's an example of one of those bass sounds. Other synth bass sounds have a simple, round tone that fills the low end without sticking through the mix. So now that we know what sounds are available to us, how do we decide what sounds to use in our worship sets? This is a really big topic, and we could probably fill multiple videos with trying to answer that question, but I will do my best to boil it down to 3 steps. The first step is to listen critically to the song. You'll want to listen to the song in a way that allows you to focus on the sounds that are happening. Start at the very beginning of the song. Usually there's an intro where there's not any lyrics or very little, so you can hear what's going on instrumentally. You'll want to identify sounds that you hear through each section. So the piano, the warm pad, bright synth lead, if there are any arps or bass sounds. Then as you go through each section of the song, write them down as you listen. Notice when there are shifts in dynamics. Oftentimes, new sounds will be introduced as you move into new sections. As the dynamics of a song ebb and flow, often the sounds being used will change as well. So let's walk through what it would look like to write down all the sounds that you hear section by section in a song. So let's say you start your song at the very beginning, you listen to the intro and the verse, you hear a piano and a warm pad. Then you move into the chorus, you hear a little bit more happening. Let's say you hear a synth bass as well. Then you move into the second verse, the piano and the pad are still there, and then you hear an arp come in. Then in the next chorus, you hear piano, pad, the arp, and the synth bass, which is still there. Then you move into a bridge and it goes back down dynamically to just a piano and a warm pad. Then as you build up through the bridge, you hear the synth bass come back in, and then you hear the arp come back in as well. And then at the very end of the song, with the last chorus, you hear all of the sounds. This is a super common example of a worship song today. If it helps you to think about the song this way in sections and in the sounds that you hear, I recommend writing them down even on your chord chart as you go through and pick out your sounds. The second step to choosing what sounds you're going to play is to pick sounds that are cohesive. This means that they sound good together throughout your entire set list. So depending on what you're using as your sound source, you may have some limits on what sounds or how many sounds you can use at one time. Today, I'm going to be using the Sunday Keys app running on my iPad to build my patch. So let's walk through and choose all the sounds. So we're going to start with a piano sound, and I'm going to choose an acoustic piano for this patch. Let's see what this one sounds like. Let's choose that one. And then for my next section, I'm going to choose a warm pad. And let's just go with our basic warm pad one. Yeah, that'll fill that space nicely. And then for my third section, I'm going to choose a synth lead sound so that if I want to play any lead lines on my right hand, that's great. And then for an arp, I think I want to choose a chord arp, one that propels me through the song. Yeah, that's perfect. And then we'll choose a bass sound. And I think I'm going to pick one that has a bit of distortion. Let's do this one. Perfect. So now that I have all 5 of my sounds picked out, I want to make sure that I bring them to nice levels so that they can all be heard well. So I'll bring my piano all the way up. I'll bring my pad to halfway or so, maybe a bit more. And then let's bring the lead sound into about halfway and see what this sounds like. Yeah, that fits nicely in the background, but still sticks out a bit. And then if we bring in our arp, yeah, that's nice. And then the bass sound, I'll bring in just a bit. The third step to choosing all of your sounds to play in a set list is to layer all of these sounds together cohesively. You'll want to determine if there are specific parts you want to play and where those are going to be on the keyboard. Each kind of sound typically has a note range where it sounds best, but you'll have to take into consideration what parts you're going to play in what areas. So for example, my lead sound, I want to have mostly in my right hand range for any lead lines or riffs that I want to play up there. But my synth bass sound, I will most likely have in the lower left hand range because it is a lower sound and I'll be playing it with the left hand. So let's open up our layer range editor and let's find our lead sound. It's this blue one and it stretches across the entire keyboard. So I'm going to drag that all the way up so that it is just playable from this C up the rest of the keys. Perfect. The arp sound, I want to bring that down. We're actually going to meet it right at the same place so that it can just be played in this range down here. That way, if I play any lead lines in the right hand, I won't be accidentally triggering the arp as well. So I'm going to do that with the pad too. I'm going to bring that down to this B right here. So that way all of the pad notes that I'm playing are down here. So most likely when I'm playing chords during this song, I'll keep them in this middle range and in the left hand. And then the lead lines and parts I'll play up high. So then the piano stretches across the entire keyboard and the synth bass is in this lowest octave up to this note. So now that I know where all of my sounds are placed on the keyboard, I can be more prepared when I come to play this song and I know where I'm going to play what parts on the keyboard. If you found this video helpful, make sure you hit the like button and get subscribed to our channel so you don't miss out on any of the free content we put out every single week. I'm Julia with Sunday Sounds and I'll see you next time.